Hi, I'm Erin, and this is my channel, Dr. Arinarung, where I talk about ideas related to my teaching, my research, usually around like popular culture and fantasy, not always. And I know it's been a while since I've had time to upload something to this channel. So I thought today I would get myself sort of started again by doing something a little fun for me, hopefully fun for you as well. In that, I'm going to be talking about 5 fantasy novels that I love to teach, think a little bit about why I like to teach them and whatnot. But first off, if you like what I do, enjoy this video, please make sure you like and subscribe. Help me convince my bosses and the powers that be at the university that this is legitimate work, and then I'll have more time to do it. um, so yes, thinking about teaching. All of the books today are going to be sort of things that I have taught already in a class. We'll be talking a bit like about that. One of the reasons that I think it'd be fun to do this, both for people who may be teachers themselves, also for perhaps students or people who haven't been in class since high school, but like to think about it because I'd like to think about books and whatnot, is thinking about the many reasons we teach something, what goes into putting together a syllabus. Because for those of you who've never been sort of in the front of the classroom and on the planning side, a lot goes into it. I mean, when you first start to plan a class, there are so many things you want to teach, and there's never enough time. And so a lot of thought goes into planning what goes with what are the themes you want to talk about in the class, what's the approach you want to take, what books work best for that approach, how dark are they? I actually have a bad habit of including all dark books in my classes, which can be a little much for students, so I'm trying to not do that as often. But yeah, all of these things come into planning a class. And so what I want to talk about today is 5 books that worked that I definitely want to teach again, and a little bit about why they worked and the way I framed them in my classes. So the first book that I want to talk about is N.K. Jemisin's The 100,000 Kingdoms. As you can see, this is my teaching copy. There's always lots of post-it notes. Sometimes there's, in fact, too many post-it notes in terms of them actually being usable, particularly in a quick moment in class. But even so, always a sign that I am teaching from a book is lots and lots of post-it notes in there. This was a hard choice for me just because it was between this and the 5th season, right? And I've taught Gemma since the 5th season a number of times, really love teaching it. There's a lot of good reasons to teach it because there's quite actually a lot of academic criticism written on it, and you don't get that for a lot of fantasy books. Fantasy, particularly sort of epic fantasy or high fantasy, like I would sort of consider this book, there's not a lot of criticism written on it outside of stuff written on Lord of the Rings still. That's changing, but still it's less popular even within fantasy criticism, if you will, for various reasons that perhaps we could think about. But so Jemison's 5th season has lots written on it, and it's exciting, and it's lots of very good work. So that one is very fun to teach. However, I always come back to this one. I think the reason this one teaches so well for me is that it is so recognizably high fantasy. And I'll explain that for a moment. So I have taught this in first year classes in like a unit that had to do with sort of the fantastic in literature. I have taught it in intro fantasy classes, and I've taught it in a graduate seminar. And of course, all 3 of those classes, we talked about different things, and we looked at different aspects of the text, and it worked really, really well in all 3. And I think part of that is it is an easy read. And by that, I don't mean a simple read. It's definitely not a simple book, but it's prose-wise something that students can read relatively quickly. Although it is long, it's not a book that feels long, if that makes sense. And so it is something that even first years, not all, because there's never a class with 100% reading. I'm not naive. But many, even first years, read the entire thing when we studied it. And it's so good because for sort of particularly teaching fantasy and teaching the genre conventions of high fantasy, because Jemisin is clearly, particularly when she was writing this novel, clearly someone who loved high fantasy, and she's spoken about this in interviews before, but was constantly disappointed by the genre, right? And that's something perhaps a lot of you might understand, perhaps others not so much. But and because of that, this is very recognizably high fantasy. It's dealing with a lot of those tropes, in the sense that you have a sort of chosen one figure for various reasons that I don't want spoilers, so we won't get into. You have light versus dark. You have sort of enslaved gods, the sort of magic system. You have sort of a mystery at the heart of it. You have an idea of sort of seeming stability into chaos, into stability again, except she's undermining that in various ways. Like, the genre tropes are all there. The structures we expect from fantasy are there. But Jemisin does something very different with all of them. She subverts them in different ways, but she doesn't leave them behind, right? She's still very recognizably writing within high fantasy. And that's why this novel works so well to teach. On top of that, it has interesting questions about race, about colonial themes, and about like gender fluidity with the god Nahatoth. And so all of these are things that students really love to get into and talk about and think about alongside these questions of genre that often come up in terms of the class. So that one, it's just all around works on so many levels, so many different layers of nuance can be brought to it, in terms of the text. And that's sort of one thing, before I jump into that second one thing I want to say in terms of books that I choose to teach, that's the requirement, right? It's required that when I reread, there's something new, there's something different, because I'll always reread a text, even a long novel, before I teach it or and while I'm teaching it. And the key is, if I'm always seeing different things, that means there's so many different types of things that students can latch onto, and even often stuff that I haven't seen yet, right? And it's that sort of text that is so generative of different interpretations and meanings that are key to a successful class discussion, so that students aren't all sort of saying the same things, agreeing. There's a lot to pull apart. There's a lot to think about. There's interpretive puzzles to play with. And on that same note of different interpretive puzzles and things to play with beneath a seemingly sort of easy to read story, if you will, the second book I want to mention is Naomi Novik's Uprooted. This book, I've only, again, notes, perhaps even more. I've only actually taught this book in one class. I want to teach it in more. I haven't fit it into any other classes yet. I'm working on that. But when I taught it, it went very well. It was in the context of sort of an introductory high fantasy class. And so again, this one is very much in conversation with the fantasy tradition, and more specifically, the more fairy tale side of the fantasy tradition. If those of you who are familiar with this text would recognize that, in that it's playing with sort of Eastern European folk tales. Baba Yaga is sort of at work in here. There's a very interesting dragon figure, so she's playing with that as well. The idea of, you know, the sacrifice of the girl that the town sacrifices in order for protection from the dragon. That's how the book opens, but it's not what you think it would be from that opening, right? So she's playing with the different types of fantasy and the fantasy tropes and genres, but in ways that are breaking from how they're normally used. And that is what can really lead to conversation and help us to understand those tropes and everything that those tropes can do a little more fully. Although there's not a lot sort of scholarly written on Novik's novel at the moment, and that will be true for most of actually what I'm talking about for the rest of this video. There's a lot there still, right? And this novel engages with a number of things that are of interest right now in terms of literary, like academic and critical culture. And that's something that you always need to think about, right? Because if students are writing essays on things, they need something to research. They need a frame. They need a conversation to join as part of that research, because any good paper should be joining into some sort of conversation that's ongoing, not just sort of shouting from the trees and hoping you're original. And so with Novik, there's other types of things that can be entered into, right? We can think about it in relation to genre, in relation to fairy tale. There's also at the center of it, and students really latch onto this and love this, a really important female friendship that is not simplistic and is actually sort of quite complicated, but is very much the core of this text affectively in a lot of ways. And students really enjoy talking about that. They like sort of the sidelining of romance in favor of this bond between the two women in the story. And I mean, on top of that, we have like adventure. We have the things you'd expect from high fantasy and fairy tale, princes who are problematic as opposed to just unthinkingly heroic, if you will, and really interesting environmental themes that are like with Jemison's work that I was mentioning. You have connections between talking a little bit about colonialism, about the relationship between human beings and nature. And of course, anyone who's read a lot of fantasy knows that this is something that fantasy is intimately aware of and interested in sort of the decentering the human within the fantasy landscape and not privileging the human within the fantasy landscape. And that's something that, you know, to varying degrees, perhaps is falling out of some contemporary fantasy, but is something very much at work in the Novik, and it's something that students like to think about and write about as well in classes. So this next book will perhaps surprise some of you, will not surprise people who are actually subscribers of my channel and know what most of my content tends to be about, at least so far. And I want to preface this one in that I've taught it a number of times. I absolutely am going to continue teaching it. I'm not sure I've taught it well. I'm going to explain that in a second. And that's a challenge for me. I love that sort of thing. So the next book I'm talking about, Steven Erikson's Gardens of the Moon. Again, teaching notes. Which actually, practical thing, mass market paperbacks, not fun for teaching. Great in terms of their cheapness for students and affordability. No margins though. So very, very hard to take notes in and not have your post-it notes actually covering the text of the book. So minor thing, but that's sort of one of the things you don't tend to think about when you think about teaching or studying fantasy, is whether the book has ample margins for notes. These definitely don't. But back to the actual practicalities of teaching Gardens of the Moon. So in complete contrast to the two books that I've already talked about, this is not an easy read. And those of you who know, you know, it's almost a meme when it comes to Malazan, that it's dense, it's difficult, it's hard, and that's often overstated. Don't get me wrong. But teaching this has revealed some very interesting things about that sort of fandom trope. When I first taught Gardens of the Moon, it was in the context of an epic fantasy class. I've since taught it again in a graduate seminar. And in both cases, I was actually very surprised because these are groups of students. They were sort of upper level students for the most part, third year, fourth year graduate, right? What seemed clear to me, or what I seemed to believe leading into first teaching this, was that this was the perfect environment for it, where you'd have students who are used to reading difficult texts taking on this fantasy. That's not what happened. In both classes, there were, of course, a handful of students who loved the text, really dove down into it, were fascinated by it, kept reading the series. In one case, there's one or two who actually had already read the series, coming back to it, and so loved talking about it and that sort of thing. But for the most part, students struggled a lot. And that's on me, because it is very much on the professor if a student's struggling unduly with the work that you've put. So part of the challenge for me, and why I will teach it again, although only at upper levels, is that I haven't found the right way to teach it yet. I think I need more structure, probably, because difficulty sometimes requires more guidance than perhaps I generally give in a class. And so it wasn't enough to do sort of my regular thing in the sense of trying to facilitate them sort of exploring things. And of course, we looked at it through the lens of genre and genre tropes. We looked at it through things like philosophy, history, ideology of power, things like that. We looked at just a number of different ways of considering the text and dug into some particular scenes that I'm a fan of. Some of you will be familiar with. So scenes around Silver Fox, for instance, is a favorite of mine. And of course, the ending. And so we did all these things. And there still were a lot of students who just were like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's happening. And so I think it's an interesting problem. And one of the reasons behind it, and this is something I'm working to challenge, is that I think even in a university classroom, students are approaching fantasy expecting an easy read. And again, I don't mean simple when I say easy, right? I never teach something that there isn't a lot to dig out of it. So I don't teach simple texts. But by easy read, I mean just sort of like you're able to follow the narrative. You're affectively grabbed in ways that are sort of very popular in terms of people for their enjoyment reading. So it's almost like students, despite being in a classroom setting, students expect the fantasy novels that they're reading to conform to their pleasure reading. And there's room in a classroom for affect, for pleasure, for investigating what causes pleasure in a text. I'm very pro that, but critically, and that can't be the only thing, right? So basically, this novel I will teach again, absolutely, and I will figure out a way to do it, and I will report back. Because I do think that there is a lot there. It's an important novel to teach. There's starting to be criticism in academic journals on Malazan. And so I do think that it's something that I will return to as I think of new ways to teach it. And certainly if you have any suggestions, Malazan peeps, feel free to put them in the comments. I definitely appreciate that. So in stark contrast to Gardens of the Moon, which of course I would bet, particularly in the third year class, there were quite a few students who probably didn't finish, if we're being honest. My next book is a student pleaser in terms of reading, in that it's a novella, and it seems quite simple, but is not. So the book I am talking about is Seanan McGuire's Every Heart a Doorway. This is the first one that's not strictly in the sort of epic high fantasy realm in terms of what I teach. If you're not familiar with this book, it's more of a boarding school / portal fantasy, in the sense that it is set in a boarding school. It's in North America, and it is for kids and it's teens who are at the school who have gone through magical doorways to other lands and for whatever reason have come back and of course are now dealing with living in our primary world again, a world in which no one believes that they went anywhere else, that no one believes that they're telling the truth about what happened and their experiences. And they're both trying to deal with that, trying to deal with basically being told that their narrative is a trauma narrative, something else must have happened because what they're talking about can't be real. So they're dealing with that, but then they're also dealing with the idea that they don't feel at home in this world at all. It's that portal world that is home to them. And so this book is a student pleaser. I've taught it a couple of times now, not at the first year level yet. I really want to teach it at the first year level once I am able to do that again. But students love it. They read all of it because it is very short. So the advantages of teaching novellas, and they find it sort of quite easy to read, but also on one level, very, very sort of understandable in terms of some particular themes, right? So on the surface of it, this is a fantasy that's very important for different issues of representation, both in terms of sexuality, a little bit in terms of race, not a lot, also in terms of gender identity. And so all of that is something that students like to talk about and dig into, particularly when you're talking about the importance of representation in popular culture, in particular in the ways that things get normalized, right, in our society. And that's a great conversation to have. I love starting there. However, one of the things I love about teaching this book is that there is so much more to it than that. There's questions of home, obviously, that it would have to be that. There's certainly critiques of our current North American society and the way that it places almost demands of particular types of happiness on its citizens and on family members. So family is a big theme in this as well. But then the nerd in me loves this in that it's also in conversation with the entire sort of Gothic tradition, which you might not expect, right? From a boarding school, urban fantasy, portal fantasy type thing. But the main character of this book, who is a romantic asexual, Nancy, went to the halls of the dead. And because like we're seeing so much of her, and there's a couple of other characters who link to this as well, the twins Jack and Jill are part of that. They have all gone to lands that are very, very influenced by the Gothic literary tradition, by Frankenstein, by Dracula, by pre-Raphaelite aesthetics from like the 19th century, by even there's references like to Hammer films in this book. There's the Addams family. Like there's all of these Gothic literary and popular cultural references going on in a way that is really interesting. And I have another video that's going to be coming on this because I've been working a lot on this aspect of McGuire's novella and the way that she's creating a sort of asexual Gothic through this and a couple of the other novellas in the series. Watch for that if you're interested. But this means this is one of the things I actually always look for when I'm choosing books for my class. Can they both speak to issues that are popular in terms of current criticism, so students have a conversation to grab onto, to join to in their research for their essays or the presentations and whatnot, but also are there multiple levels? And my favorite of multiple levels, and that's just because it's me, favorites I should say, are ideology critiques. So this is true of all of the ones I've chosen, but also connection to literary tradition in very meaningful ways. Particularly when I'm talking about fantasy, I very much follow Brian Atterbury in his sort of idea of fantasy as stories about stories, like intrinsically, right? So this idea that fantasy is always, always in relation to, right, some sort of other story, literary tradition, mythic tradition, and this sort of thing and idea. And so most of the works I will choose will always connect in some way through that and allow us to have conversations about that. That's it. Those are the 5 books. I hope you enjoyed it. And certainly, as promised, I will have some more structured video essays coming soon. And like and subscribe if you've gotten this far and you haven't done that yet. And as always, it's been a joy, and thank you for watching.